thank you all for tuning in again. We now commence the final panel of CyFy 2020 on a theme that has been pretty foundational to the debates and discussions we have had over the past 5 days, namely data. How should we govern it? Should we govern it? And the data governance debate has taken various forms over the past few years. There was the entire data as the new oil trend. We've also had emerging terms such as data sovereignty and data colonialism, as well as new frameworks of data ownership emerging, such as Astha Kapoor's speed talk just before this on the concept of data stewardship. I start the panel with a fairly fundamental and basic question, which is who should own the data, and how can data governance be shaped in a way that maximizes the benefit of this data for society at large? Over to you, ma'am. Rama, Vedashree, she'll be starting. Yeah.
So thank you, Trisha, and thank you for having me here, and welcome to all the participants of this session. To answer Trisha's question, I would like to first step back a little bit to set the context for this entire data-driven innovation and data-led entrepreneurship, as I would like to call it. And this data-led entrepreneurship came from large startups, which later became global technology majors, or it could also be an agri-tech startup and a fintech startup in any remote part of India. So there is a data-led entrepreneurship that the technology world and the digital world has spawned, and because of which this entire need for regulation and governance has come into the picture. So when you look at any one of this data-led entrepreneur, whatever is the size and shape of this company and this entrepreneurship, it is important that they're trying to solve a problem, and they're solving a problem by using an existing algorithm or a new algorithm sometimes, and they're building that technology stack in the platform to be able to onboard consumers to be able to experience what they're creating, the innovation that they're creating. It's important to remember this holistic picture before we get into the rat hole of discussion of only data. Similarly, when you look at this large data enterprise, there's a whole lot of it. It's not just the way they collect data, the way they process and innovate on data and the technology stack. It's also the experiences that they create based on which maybe third-party ecosystems through APIs are getting connected. I would like to see this this entire data conversation going into 3 pieces. One is innovation interest data, competition interest data, and public interest data. And I think we need to have a nuanced discussion in each of this, right? So when you were to answer Trisha's question, I would say fundamentally the data belongs to whoever is the data giver or the user. But there is a recipient which is actually looking at this data, is probably doing a lot more processing, innovation to be able to utilize that data and to give good either to the consumer or even sometimes to the society at large, right? So we need to understand that piece. And if we can have a nuanced discussion around, is it innovation interest data? So what can be put into in the public domain so more innovation can happen, which could be voluntary from that single data entrepreneur or data enterprise, as we would like to call that entity, or it could be, you know, regulation led or incentivized, right? So we need to have that. And when it comes to competition interest data, there is a lot of accountability, transparency principles that can be baked in to ensure that it's not only the consumer interest, but also the broader governance interest is met. When it comes to public good data or public interest data, as we would like to term it, I think there is a broader discussion around what kind of data needs to go into the domain. It need not necessarily be only government data, but it could also be business data. But there needs to be discussions with the industry to understand what is this public interest data across various domains. So if we hinge all our discussions around the concept of a data enterprise and look at these 3 facets of data, I think we can have a better conversation.
Thank you, ma'am. Very fascinating framework for data. It's based on how data is used, which is a fairly interesting way of putting it. Same question, I will turn to Ephraim. Ephraim, over to you.
Thank you so much, Trisha. I hope you can hear me very well. So as just building onto what Rama talked about, the trouble is that there's that balance, trying to find out about whether it's your data only or also how it affects other people. So treating data like it's property fails to recognize either the value that the varieties of personal information serves or the abiding interests that individuals have in personal information, even if they choose to sell it. So this sometimes can incentivize some people to sell their data in a way that it trades away their privacy rights for very little value, while injecting enormous friction into the free flow of information. So to ensure that there is free flow of information, there is need to balance and being aware that the first most important thing, it's a human right. So trading away a human right, especially these basic inalienable rights, especially the ones contained in the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, is a slippery slope, and I would strongly put or put a stop, or to ensure that these rights and principles are not traded away, the same way we've fought against other rights and principles which have been traded away offline for various years, be it women's rights, rights to vote, rights against rights for minorities. We cannot trade away rights for any reason, be it political or for any convenience reason. So those would be my introductory remarks regarding that question. Thanks.
Yes, thank you, Ephraim. Again, an interesting framing. It's not about who owns data, but how it affects people. And that actually brings us naturally on to Melinda, because you are the privacy policy director at Facebook, and Ephraim did bring up the concept of privacy being a fundamental right. What is your answer to that question? Who owns data?
Thank you. Yes. I think that, again, I would agree that the construct of owning data is not the right one, not the right way to think about it. I think, personal data is fundamentally different from tangible property. And so, the kinds of rights that can be exercised with respect to data are just fundamentally different from those that can be exercised over tangible property. Property rights are linked to, title over the property, exclusivity, right of commercial use and transfer, but none of those apply to how personal data rights have been kind of implemented and exercised around the world. And so it's really not possible to own a piece of information. When you think about pieces of personal data, such as a date of birth or a phone number, these pieces of information can be separately known and, recorded by many people at once and used by many people at once. So I think a better way of looking at rights over data is in the context of control over decisions pertaining to that data. So in that sense, what people are entitled to is the right to make decisions over personal data, and as an exercise of this right may choose to consent to the use of such data in different ways by different companies or entities. People also have the right to privacy, which is about control and agency over personal information, not ownership. And companies have a right to use data if it's validly collected and processed in accordance with user consent or other accountability frameworks. And so I think that the draft PDP bill, for example, is consistent with its view that people have rights to exercise autonomy and decision making over various aspects of personal data. And that this is very much aligned with global privacy regimes as well, which have almost entirely relied on principles of control, agency, and trust to regulate data, primarily by focusing on user rights and guarding them against harm from misuse of data. And so treating personal data as property that can be owned actually takes us away from ensuring strong data regulation, which is regulation that protects individual rights and enables innovation.
Yes, thank you, Melinda. And finally, over to Rahul. What is your answer to the big poser for the beginning of this panel?
Hey, it's really unfair to get three people in front of me who've sliced this topic into as fine a set of shreds as possible to expect me to squeeze one more out, but I'm going to try. And what I would say is, look, I'm actually relatively allergic to this concept of owning data, because I think we derive this concept because instinctively we look at big tech companies that have got a lot of value, and we said, look, they get a lot of value out of our information and our data, and so we should have some part of that value. So essentially, we are deriving our concept of ownership from some sort of fractional interest in the big valuations that we see. It feels instinctively, intuitively unfair, but that's not the way to derive a concept around data. Which is why I like the way Melinda has framed it, some of what Ephraim has said and what Rama has said, which is what we need to be talking about really is what right do I have in the context of the data. I think if we derive a property interest in data, we can have some of the perverse outcomes that Ephraim had indicated. And I think that if we can look at it in the context of some sort of boundary management, privacy essentially is where exactly do you draw boundaries, and boundary management essentially is what rights do I have over what needs to be done with information that's personal about me, and everyone has a different boundary that they will draw. So if you think about it in that context, we're really thinking about it as a right. But I think equally there's been a lot of talk about the benefits that can come out of data, and there is a concern that if we don't properly understand that, and I hope we'll get into some of that in the rest of the conversation, that we will get into that scenario that you described with one of those buzzwords that you used at the beginning of the session, which is data colonization or data colonialism. And that also is something that I think we really need to consider, because we've got to figure out how to navigate our path through that. But once again, opening comments. I'm sure there's more to add to this.
And I'm glad, Rahul, that you touched on that concept of data colonialism, because that brings us naturally to the next portion of this conversation, which is that because a lot of these entities that are in control of user data are not within sovereign borders, that many nation states are using data governance as a way of getting that data into sovereign borders to extract value from it, or so on. But it's complex because cyberspace is borderless. So what does sovereignty in this space really mean? And again, going back to your question, the concept of nobody owns data, that also means that we as users are not able to derive value from it. So just problematizing that to an extent. I'll now go into some of the deep dive questions. If, for instance, as I'd framed, the imposition of sovereignty is because governments lack trust in these big entities, what are possible solutions that these two can work towards to bridge the gap? I'll address the question first to Melinda, and then we can go to Rama.
Yeah, I mean, with respect to this question of data sovereignty, I think that sovereign rights of control over data is really an untenable framework. It presumes that the state has primary decision-making power over personal data. In fact, people have rights over personal data, and this is obviously confirmed by the Vedashree ruling in recent years. And companies have rights over certain kinds of data that may be proprietary, confidential, or a key basis for investment, in line, of course, with IP laws and general contractual principles. But I think what's underlying the framing of the concept of data sovereignty is this lack of trust, as was pointed out. And I agree that trust is essential. And well-balanced regulation is a key component to fostering that trust. And when I think about trust, I think that different solutions will be necessary depending on the context. So there's three relationships, really. There's trust between companies and people, there's trust between people and government, and there's trust between governments and companies. And so for the first one, between companies and people, to foster that trust, companies have certain duties to uphold, and that includes respecting people's rights and decisions with respect to their personal data, through consent, accessing data, deleting data. It includes being transparent about practices, and it includes being responsible stewards and of data, protecting it from misuse or breach. When I think about trust between people and government, I think about it as a former regulator. I think about it from a regulator's perspective, and I think that means enforcing laws that protect people, but doing in a way that is transparent, that is harm-based, and addresses the most meaningful concerns of people. And then finally, when I think about the trust between governments and companies, I think that the way to engender that trust is through partnerships to achieve societal objectives, for example, through voluntary data sharing initiatives. I think it includes having open, constructive dialogue between a regulator and companies, ensuring that regulators and policymakers have the right technical expertise, and finally, creating an enabling environment for innovation, for example, through regulatory sandboxes, which is a really important concept that has been included in the draft PDP bill as well. So I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you, Melinda. And Rama, over to you.
Yes. To add to what Melinda said, I would say typically I think this entire discussion and discourse around data sovereignty, I would say, is stemming from two facets. One is the economic value of data, and as a country, are we missing out on it? And how can I exercise control of the enterprise which is this data so that I can derive that economic value? I think that is pretty much, most research and evidence has really not supported this kind of an argument. Second one is the fear of loss of control because of access to this data from all the global companies, and probably leading to access to foreign public authorities. I think typically the entire discourse of sovereignty of data is coming from these two facets. As a country, are we harnessing the economic value of the data, which probably another corporate has harnessed? Second, are we at the risk of access by public authorities of another country? I think both these, first, at an industry level and government level, I think there is a lot more to be done to ensure that there is accountability and transparency frameworks become more richer, and the right of the users is respected, user rights is respected, users access to data and probably request for portability. Those are, I think the trust factor also comes from that point. And maybe regulation can enable enhancing this trust factor by better disclosure mechanisms on what is being done with the data, where the data is being shared. I think while regulation can help, that sovereign control of this, I don't think is going to help in any way. If the fear of this entire discourse is around access to public authorities, surveillance by public authorities of other countries, I think there's more, it's more, according to me, a data diplomacy, cyber diplomacy tracks that have to facilitate those discussions. And it's not just the sovereign control, because in a digital economy, if data does not flow through global grids, I don't think there can be any innovation or value harnessed out of data.
That's absolutely. And one complex aspect of this debate, of course, is that in different countries, in different contexts, the triangle that Melinda also mentioned of industry, user, and government is managed differently, and hence there are different kinds of frameworks that emerge as a result of these differing relationships. And I was wondering if we could just go into some examples of these emerging models of data governance, how they're balancing this triangle, and what practices, best practices do you think we can take from these, given that the contexts are very different, trust in institutions varies from country to country, just as the relationship between government and citizen varies from country to country. I'll turn first to Rahul to address this question.
Yeah, so look, I mean, I think there are obviously, this is the challenge. Everyone's trying to figure out how to balance all of this. One, to continue to incentivize innovation, because the only way we're going to really get more out of the data that we think is useful is by constantly innovating. At the same time, trying to get the individual, the privacy that the individual needs, and we always have the state which has its interests to govern. In India, we're doing some interesting experiments with portability. And the portability that we talk about in India is not the portability that I've come to understand that Europe and the US talk about. Portability, Melinda, forgive me, is, for instance, porting out of Facebook. And India thinks about it slightly differently. The way we think about portability is it possible for me, the user who has some information, say in a bank or some financial institution or in a healthcare institution or in a telecom institution, or even the tax that the government has and the record of my tax, can I use that information to generate more value? How would I generate value out of this? Today, the process of getting a loan actually is very cumbersome. You need to physically carry pieces of paper from one place to the other. The process of getting a second opinion in healthcare is very cumbersome. You actually have to carry your scans and documents from one place to the other. But if we've got technology, and so, Trisha, my answer to you is one way to do this is with technology, to actually triage that triangle using technology. If we can create a framework that will allow us to port data, the data that we want, from government institutions, from private sector companies, at the behest and with the command exclusively of the user. That's the data framework, and the data framework currently is being rolled out in the financial services sector. It looks like it is going to be rolled out in the healthcare sector. We know that that MeitY has come out with a framework that they call the Node framework, which defines these open data ecosystems, which in a sense is creating a framework whereby the data that's locked in silos can actually be unlocked and moved at the instruction of the user from one part of the silo to the other. So I mean, this is not a perfect solution, but this is one way to deal with the triangle, which is unblock some of the data that's locked within each of those entities and have them move around the triangle, thereby unlocking value for the user, unlocking greater value in the ecosystem. And at the same time, retaining, everyone hates to lose a customer. We don't have to lose a customer. If you can share some part of the data of that customer that will make that person a valid customer, a valuable customer for someone else, or a valuable user for add to the services that the government can provide. So, I mean, that's one framing, and India's got the technological infrastructure to do it. So it's interesting to see where I think this will go.
That's interesting because, yes, the deeper framework is quite interesting in that sense because it is perhaps most revolutionary in that it places the control of what is defined as a legitimate use of your data with the users as opposed to pinning it to some framework that we do not fully understand and that's very abstract to our context. Same question to Ephraim. What are some emerging models of governance in your context in Africa? And do you see some practices emerging from there that the rest of the world could, for instance, benefit from?
Thank you so much. So just building on what Rahul has said, especially on the right to data portability, this is an emerging data governance model that is coming up, especially in the legislation. Some of you might be aware that post GDPR, there's been a race, if I may call it a race, globally and also in Africa, where I'm from, for people to come up with various data protection and privacy laws. So one of the things which is currently being legislated upon is and is coming up in various languages across 26 countries so far that have been drafting laws, is the right to data portability. So putting that right there. So this has not fully taken off, but I'll give an example of in the telecommunication sector, especially linking this to competition law, whereby over the last several years, especially in Kenya, where I'm originally from, you would note that there is that right for you to port your number from a specific telco to another telco and port your data from that to another. So this was even pre the data protection laws. So this is a very interesting form of model, and that right is mostly to data portability is as just the same thing as Rahul has mentioned, to the financial sector because of credit history. It's something that is important and has been is currently in laws or is currently in regulations that competition authorities are trying to link that. So that is an interesting thing. But initially, this was not linked when the competition authorities or competition laws were being drafted in such a manner. They were not linked as a right to data protection. They were linked as a way to unbundle monopolies over data or over different subsets of the market. So this is something that is an interesting model, and it can be interesting to keep watching, and also to keep replicating in all the various sectors beyond just the telecommunication sector and the financial services, but also the health, as Rahul has mentioned, and others, so that it's the user who has that right over their own data, and they can choose. Today, I don't think so and so provider has served me well. I would want to port to a different provider. So the same way, for example, and maybe moving to the telecommunication space, there was a proposal around a year or two ago by Jack from Twitter to try and see if we can move to newer protocols where we can speak to each other regardless of which social media, the same way we speak to each other regardless of which email. So different protocols. So that would be an interesting space to get into, whereby I don't need to be, for example, on Instagram or on a specific Zoom or a specific GeoMeet or any other, because there's so many. For example, in this pandemic, there's so many things we've had to download because of different meetings. If we can get to a way in which we are all speaking to each other regardless of which network. For example, if I'm using Facebook, I don't need to download the same time and use Twitter, or Twitter, I don't need to download and use Facebook, or the other way around. So it will be an interesting time to get to that point where users have that control over their data. And the same way we no longer need to use, for example, to be restricted to Gmail to speak to each other, or Yahoo, or whatever type of email. I'll give a specific example. For example, Somalia, for those of us who've worked in Somalia, telecommunication sector. Somalia, currently things are changing, but 2 years ago, 1 year ago, you could not speak to another telecommunication network unless you're in that specific network. So that's the connection between networks is something which I would want, and I would hope that it gets to that level. So these are some of the emerging models, but there's so much opportunity to get beyond. The same way we evolved from using AT&T to AT&T only, to AT&T and Verizon and others. So it will be a nice time where we can get where we are not linked only. We're not supposed to only to be one platform, but we can use whatever platform and speak to each other.
That's interesting. Essentially, interoperability across platforms. I wonder how that idea is going to go down at Facebook and Twitter, but it's an interesting idea nonetheless. Rama, I saw that you had raised your hand. Did you have a point?
So I just wanted to add to what Rahul said. While frameworks like DEPA are emerging and proving to, define a new accountable data sharing frameworks between the stakeholders of the ecosystem, I think accountability and the way the sharing frameworks, including the standardized protocols that would be adopted, so that even in that the data ecosystem, which is going to be the beneficiary or recipient of this sharing framework, there is a level playing field. I think it's extremely important to be able to factor that. Also, the commercial interest of the various players in the sharing ecosystem, and also security and privacy concerns, because sometimes when we mandate this kind of sharing, at some point there could also be a security vulnerability introduced or a potential privacy challenge. So I think these are frameworks that are proving to be robust, but when we look at scaling such frameworks at a much larger scale, the accountability principles of the sharing, so that there's a level playing field of the ecosystem of the beneficiaries there, and making sure that security and privacy concerns and commercial interest of the various stakeholders is. So these three principles, I would say, need to be factored. I think they're getting factored, but when you need to scale them, these need to be looked at in a lot more detail.
Yes. Thank you, ma'am. There's one issue that kind of grows out of the discussion we've had, is that especially in the Indian context, we started with the PDP, which has still not been passed, but we now have a non-personal data framework. We have a separate framework arising for the management of health data. Is this slicing data governance too thin, or do you think this adds much needed nuance to data governance in India? I'll ask Rahul first, then Rama, and then Melinda or Ephraim if you want to weigh in as well.
Sure. So look, I mean, I think to answer the two aspects you raised, one was health data, and then you can also arguably say financial data as well, and then there's non-personal data. So when you talk about health data, the way I see it, health data is going to be a subset of the PDP bill. So the PDP bill covers personal data and personal sensitive data. Health data, depending on which way you look at it, in certain circumstances, something which is arguably health data could be personal data, but in others, most circumstances, it's going to be sensitive personal data. And so I would see the framework that's coming out of the National Health Authority, the National Digital Health Mission, all being in a sense, the codes of practices that the Data Protection Authority has to set up, and these are the codes of practices specific to a sector. And I think we are going to get that. In many ways, I think this is not slicing and dicing in an unhealthy way. I think the good thing about the PDP bill is that the PDP bill is drafted based on principles, and so it's very much principle driven, which allows sectors the flexibility to define things more narrowly, and I think that's what the health data ecosystem is about. Non-personal data is an entirely different kettle of fish, because by definition, non-personal data is everything that is not personal data, which essentially is arguing that there is not a single category of data that is not going to be regulated. Now, and there are many implications to this. I think certainly there is a value to trying to figure out what we must do with those categories of data that are outside of this clearly defined bucket as being personally identifiable, because we know that data that at the time of collection was not personally identifiable, when added to all the other data that a data collector has, could throw up profiles that are quite narrowly identifiable with all the way down to certain individuals. And in those circumstances, arguably, we should have some framework for it. But equally, there's a whole set of data that this brings within a bucket of regulation that perhaps we could do without. And the reason why I'm concerned about doing this with a broad brush is because a lot of innovation depends on the ability to, in a sense, experiment with assets, with things that you can experiment with. The risk, of course, is that we should not allow harm to occur. We should not allow privacy harm to occur to individuals. We should not allow societal harms to occur to nations or even communities within that. And I think that's the premise with which the government went into regulating non-personal data. The current framing of it, though, I think is a little too broad brush for it to address all of these concerns. And so I think there are some concerns I have with the concept of community data, and the fact that we're going to have a community data trustee that's going to take decisions on behalf of the community. I don't know, what the governance framework is behind that, because how do we know that data trustee is going to be working in the interest of the entire community? In a residents' welfare association in any city in India, that there is one president of the Residents' Welfare Association who does things for him and his small group of people who are his favored few. And that's just not an efficient way to set up the governance for something as important as data. So how do we think about those sorts of things, I think, is still missing in the report. Though I understand that the Chris Gopal Krishnan Committee has received a number of comments. They're going through it, and I would imagine that they're coming out with a revised framework. And hopefully we'll see some of these issues reflected in that.
All valid points taken. Ms. Vedashree, did you want to weigh in on this question as well?
We have a lot of disagreements on the draft NPD report. We have made a very strong submission, which is there on the DSCA website. I think the first thing is it's extremely important that any mandatory sharing of non-personal data should first look at our privacy rights and personal user rights being violated. Second, commercial interests of the platform which has done all the innovation, that needs to be also factored. And of course, I already talked about the sharing and the other obligations that come up when data gets shared. I also don't personally, and as a representative of my organization, we don't really subscribe to this new concept of community data that is being floated, because when you look at public, private, business data plus community data, there is going to be a lot of overlap between all these constituents, right? Particularly when it comes to public data and community data and private data. How do you deal with all of this? And I think it is also going to the extent of you're fundamentally debating on what is non-personal data and consent for anonymization. So a lot of these challenges are there. I think it's still a draft. There is a lot of submissions that have been made. I believe they would look at it and revisit it. But it's extremely important that the non-personal data bill or the non-personal data discussion does not dilute the personal data and the privacy protection that needs to be done. That should go through, and that should have a strong regulatory framework. And then we look at what else needs to be done to govern the data so that there is better accountability and transparency from the businesses.
Thank you. We have this interesting question from the audience, which is the problem the techno-deterministic neoliberal business model that has enabled growth and data collection at all costs? Data for so long was collected without regulation that it has normalized its own methods.
So look, I mean, I think, that's a loaded statement, because this techno liberal and all of that with regard to the collection of data sounds pejorative, but we all are benefiting from it. Our lives have improved immeasurably because of the conveniences that we have got, just because data allows personalization. That and just let's not just talk about the personal benefits of being able to know how long it's going to take to get to the next meeting, even though traffic changes on the way. Personalization helps with medicine. It helps with a number of things which are actually very very game changing in its implications. I mean, I think that there is certainly benefits to data. What we've realized, and that's why I disagree with the second part of the comment as well, is that I don't think it's normalized it. In fact, to the contrary, I think as we realize more about this, we're rebelling against it more. And as a result, we're finding that we have to regulate it in ways that many of us think it's too late, because some of the entities that collect information are really large, really important to a lot of the things that we do, and we're struggling to figure out how to regulate them. So I mean, but that is where we are. And the good news is that we've been here before. I think Ephraim made a really good analogy to telecom, because telecom wouldn't have expanded the way it did if we didn't solve portability. Because if everyone was going to have its own network and you had to be on your network to speak to someone else, you weren't going to be able to speak to anyone meaningful. You weren't going to be able to speak to all your friends. So we've been here before. We've been in places where these entities have grown up on their own. And we've found ways in which to regulate them such that, or just change the way in which they work such that everyone can benefit. But every time we've done this, it's been a painful transition. And I think that a lot of the griping and moaning that you hear, neoliberal or otherwise, is just that, the growing pains of us getting to full grips with everything that data can offer us.
Melinda, I saw that you had a reaction to the question as well. Would you like to give your thoughts?
I thought Rahul kind of well captured kind of my thoughts about it being a kind of pejorative statement in the framing. I mean, you know, I'm not quite sure. There's different ways of looking at what the quote unquote problem is, and I'm not sure we would all agree that, you know, there is a problem or there's one problem. I mean, I think what the truth is that strong data protection regulation is, you know, a necessary and important aspect of kind of ensuring responsible growth and innovation in the digital economy and supporting entrepreneurship and growth and potential. So I think I absolutely agree that rules and regulations are necessary, and I think, you know, India has an incredibly thriving and valuable, you know, IT business processing economy that has continued to grow despite the growth or the quote unquote problems that some might see at the same time. So I think, you know, just as we're talking about some of these issues, we need to be very precise about what is the issue, what is the problem, and what is the solution that we're using to address it. And I would just echo something that Rahul said earlier about, for example, the non-personal data proposal being a very blunt instrument. And so I think, you know, we would all agree, and certainly Facebook would see the enormous potential and value of de-identified and aggregated data being used for public, you know, policy and policymaking purposes. We share a tremendous amount of aggregate data with the Indian government and with, you know, through partnerships with academic and other institutions to solve real world problems around, you know, kind of COVID. We're doing a lot of information sharing around location and mobility data to understand the impact of government policies and to better target government policies. But I think, you know, when you look at how to kind of better harness some of that data, the answer is not to impose a kind of the blunt instrument of a non-personal data mandatory data sharing regime, because it is a much more granular issue. Non-personal data is not a thing. It is not one thing, right? It is a lot of different types of things. And when we're thinking about problems, we need to be very specific about what we're addressing and targeting.
Yes, thank you, Melinda. We are actually 4 minutes over time. So I just wanted to thank you all for participating in this discussion. Thanks again for tuning in. And yes, thank you for being part of this panel.